face reality. The reality is most organizations on the planet really have not done a good job of documenting their processes. People will think, oh, if we just make this change, it's going to take care of things. But unless you really are getting down to the details of who's doing what are they producing, and where's that going, you're so often things just kind of don't quite connect the way that you think they're going to until you get into that level of detail.
So, Jim is an expert in the area of business process analysis and business process mapping. For the last 40 years, he's been working in this space, writing articles, writing books, presenting, but most importantly, working with customers to improve their business processes. What do you think are the issues for if you don't get your processes documented, you don't do that business analysis?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Ian. And I mean, let's face reality. The reality is most organizations on the planet really have not done a good job of documenting their processes. And yet somehow they continue to exist. There are lots of large corporations who have decades of success without really doing good process documentation. And we'll talk a little more later about what good process documentation is. So, but you could argue, okay, well, they've gotten away with it. But my feeling is they're leaving a lot on the table when they do that. There are lots of opportunities that go unmet when you don't have decent process documentation. Let's talk about those probably in three ways. The first way is just the day-to-day experience of employees. And there's this kind of low level of error, if you will, of having to follow up on things because people aren't too sure where they are, looking for information, maybe the latest form that has been revised and they don't know where that is, following up on their own outputs to see if they've been used in the way that they expected, or correcting things that it turns out that wasn't quite what the customer of that process wanted. And, how much is this? There have been some studies in the past that people spend up to 20% of their time actually just looking for information to do their jobs. And so that's huge. But, usually what happens is this is kind of an ongoing chronic level of waste, if we can call it that, that is put up with more or less. And it just feeds into the productivity numbers of the organization. Where it gets attention is when it happens and it becomes big. It's costly or hurts a customer in some way. And then it gets attention, it gets tamped down to an acceptable level. But this is kind of going on all the time. And frankly, you might say, well, maybe people don't mind that so much. But in fact, a lot of times it's kind of frustrating work that, people think something's gone off their desk and then it's coming back again, or they get new information that means they have to go change something they've done. So that's one of the things that happens when you don't have good process documentation. You haven't really specified what your desired inputs and outputs are so that, you have something that you can work with and it flows smoothly through the organization. Okay, that's one area. Another area that where it comes into play is typically between functions, and that's where things often fall through the cracks. And what we get sometimes is some politics going on inside organizations, a little bit of finger pointing. Oh, if only those people in marketing would give us the right specifications, then we'd be able to make products that meet the customer needs without having to redo them, those sorts of things. So by having good process documentation, you kind of take the politics out of that conversation and you're really focused on the process and the outputs of the process. Okay, what do you need? Let me think what I need to then do in order to produce that output that's going to meet your needs for the next step in the process. And that becomes just a good, productive conversation without any need for finger pointing anymore. No more blame game. So that's another thing that tends to go away when you have really clear process documentation. You now have a language that everyone can talk about things. And finally, I'd say there's this kind of cycle, and it's a longer term thing than those things, which happens over the course of years typically, where maybe it's a new system that causes organizations to put a new process in around it. Sometimes that's better thought about than other times. But what happens is they say, okay, well, we have a new process. We've been having problems. Now we have a new system to help us. Great, let's learn the process around that. fine. Usually things work well for a while, and then you get the natural deterioration in the process because things change. Customer requirements change, new regulations come out, whatever it may be that cause things to change. And then gradually, as change happens, you have errors creeping back into the system. And finally, it reaches an acute level, and management says, okay, we need a transformation. Bring in some consultants is the typical things to do. They put in a new process, maybe a new system to go with that process, and then the cycle starts again. But the problem is, it's this deterioration period that happens all the time. Instead of having documentation that is kept up to date with reality, recognizing when change is coming in, and then making the documentation, reflect whatever needs to be done in light of those new circumstances. So that again just doesn't often happen in many organizations. So they put up with this idea of over time, things are going to go downhill. So in summary, real quickly, basically good process documentation helps remove the multitudes of frustrating and wasteful tasks that employees have to do kind of day in and day out, kind of below the radar screen, really. Second, the good process documentation will help avoid internal politics, no more blame gaming. And finally, if you have good process documentation, then you have a single source of the truth that everyone can look at. And, having that when change does come along, you can quickly adapt and say, oh, okay, these are the things we need to change in what we do as humans in relationship to the customers and the new systems we may have.
Thank you, Jim. That you've really summarized some of the challenges we've got. But one of the things you said several times is what good process is. So can you tell me what makes a good process, or the way you would go about documenting something so it's good?
Yeah, great question. And let's make a minor distinction between a good process and good process documentation. Because, a process can be good without documentation. It's just more likely to be better with good process documentation. So I'm going to focus on the idea of taking whatever process you have and turning it into good documentation. And then you can continue to improve the process and change the documentation accordingly afterward. But what is good process documentation? Excellent question. So I would say it hits on a number of points. But first, the platform that you're using, whatever it may be to present the processes, needs to have visual appeal to it. It needs to be appealing to the people looking at it. So that they can easily understand the flows, including the inputs, outputs, and the actions that people are actually taking. Now, you and I both know about Universal Process Notation, UPN for short. And the other thing that's great about that is it puts the resource of who's doing what on the box as well, of the activity box. So you can see all those things at once in a way that is kind of like a storybook for anyone. It's a narrative. And so it's visually appealing. People can see the flow and understand what's going on. It's not too complicated. That's number one. Second is it should have a hierarchical capability. So this idea of, okay, well, what process level are you working on? Well, it really, whatever you're capturing your processes in should start from the very top of the organization and then drill down or decompose into the details, ultimately down to the task level of what people are doing. But by seeing this connection up and down the hierarchy of process, people have a much better sense of their mission and how it fits into the overall organization's purpose. So I really like that. I think that's an important piece too, to see the connections as you go up and down the process hierarchy. Third is integration with documentation, enabling documentation, I'll call it. And what do we mean by that? Well, lots of processes these days, almost the vast majority of processes that people do in work these days are producing information. They're not producing things so much anymore. Relatively few people do that. But in producing information, usually what you're doing is taking other information and somehow adding to it or transforming it in some way. So what are those input documents, if you will? And they could be anything. I mean, it could also include policies, videos, instruction sets. But a lot of times it might just be a form or a template that you need to fill out to continue it through the rest of the process after that. Ideally, that's integrated with your process diagrams so that people say, oh, okay, I see what step I have to do here. And oh, I can just click on this and I get the form I need to be able to fill that out and pass it on to the next step in the process. It doesn't necessarily have to be automated. People know where to send their information. They can automate it if they want, but the main thing is having the right information that they need as inputs to be able to produce the right outputs. The next thing after that is kind of ease of mapping. Now, I've done lots of mapping sessions. You and I have talked about that with subject matter experts. And typically, the way I'll do that is they're looking at my screen. I don't even need to be in the room. A lot of the work I do is remote. And I ask questions, and then I'm drawing the process flow diagrams as they talk. And to be able to do that while facilitating is really nice. So I don't have to take a bunch of notes offline, get off the call, draw things, send it back to them, and have them react. It's all live. And so that's very nice that it's a tool that's easy enough to use where you can build the process map right in front of the people as you're facilitating a session.
One of the benefits of actually doing this live mapping is you're actually building engagement with the end users. You're actually starting that change management process because their fingerprints are on the diagrams. If you take notes and then present it back, then there's a lack of engagement. I think there's a real power in that live workshop approach you talked about.
There really is. And what my experience is that people begin taking a lot of pride during the session. And these sessions typically go an hour and a half, something like that. And they see what's in their brain getting put onto the page. And they start to say, yeah, oh, and by the end, they're saying, wow, we just built my process out in a way I've never seen it before. They're tremendously enthusiastic. They feel proud of the work that they've done. And that's exactly what you're talking about when we talk about getting that engagement going. And so the organization, it almost becomes, even if management, which is really important, if they're really behind it, but if they're hearing from people who are in these sessions, hey, this is really good stuff, boy, that starts to really ingrain it in the culture as an approach. So a couple more things I'll mention in terms of, kind of the platform or software to build out good process documentation. It's nice if the platform has some sort of reporting features and record keeping as well, so that you can kind of understand if you want, do analysis of the processes that you've created. You can understand kind of who's acknowledging that they have seen and will follow the processes. You can control authorization of new processes, things like that. That's a nice to have. That means you don't have to create processes around the platform because it's embedded in it.
That idea of authorization may be nice to have in many companies, but if you're highly regulated, it becomes a lot more than a nice to have. That becomes
Right.
something that's mandatory. Being able to demonstrate to the auditors that actually at a certain date, this was the process we're following, but then we revised it, and here are the notes for why we changed it.
Great example. And if you don't have that in the tool that you're using, you've got to, attach that in some outside way. So if it's inside the tool, it's really nice to have that capability. Security and permissions is another one. Kind of, you might put it in the nice to have category, but it really becomes powerful when you're using it as a platform across the entire organization, because then you can give the appropriate people the right to edit some of the content as they have that capability, and you want to give them that right, and the right people to see stuff, and so on and so forth. You might even decide to expose some of the content to outsiders, to suppliers, for example, and even customers. So, having the ability to kind of manage that access and still have security around the content that you develop, that it's not going to get somehow compromised, is a great thing too. And finally, there can be other features that make any particular software platform useful. For example, integration of standards models like ISO 9001, that sort of thing in there. And other business applications, Salesforce or other sorts of applications that you might be able to integrate with. So those are some of the key points, and I think the earlier ones are really kind of almost essential. This idea of a very appealing view, so that employees like to be in there, they understand what they're looking at. This hierarchical approach, in integration with the documentation, those things are almost you almost really need to have those. And I wouldn't choose a software platform that didn't have at least those. And the other things are also very nice to have as well. Ease of mapping, I should mention that one too. That just makes that engagement, as you say, so much more powerful.
And obviously, Salesforce has made UPN the business analysis process mapping standard across. So there are training courses on there, and there'll be some links down in the comments for the Trailhead badges that you can get to understand how to map processes.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. So you could do the training course and understand how to map it. But can you talk me through, like, how would you go about a workshop where you're sitting in your office, people are in offices around the world? How do I do live mapping workshops when it's all virtual?
Yeah, the vast majority of what I do these days are virtual, meaning I'm on my computer and I'm typically sharing my screen with them so that they can see the process diagrams as I begin to create them based on their input. And people can be all over the world. As you said, I've done this with people in Europe and Asia, certainly all over the United States, all at once. They're on the line. And, typically the more people you have, the more challenging it may be, just because you want to make sure you hear all the voices. But it's not unusual to have, say, 3 or 4 people in a meeting, although it could be 1 to 10. I've done anywhere in that range. And, you simply kind of walk them through the thinking on the process. You say, and the way I like to start, I say, okay, well, what are your key outputs for this process? First, I'm trying to get the scope. So understanding what they're trying to produce, and I, just use a little arrow and label that arrow. These are going to be our outputs. And then I kind of go to the front end of the process and say, okay, that's where you're trying to get to. What causes you to start doing that? What are either your key inputs that you're going to need to be able to do your steps, or the things that trigger you to cause this process to start? So once we have that, we've now kind of got the process framed, and we can begin to talk about what are the steps involved to get from that beginning point to the end point. And the way I do it is I just kind of open it up and say, okay, let's talk about what you do. If you get it in the right order, great. If you don't, that's fine, because we can easily move the steps around and connect the arrows in the right way so that the logic comes out. And in an hour and a half meeting, which is a very typical length meeting that I might have, we'll build out 1 or 2 process diagrams. People will say, wow, that was really fantastic. You've gotten my ideas into these process diagrams. This is more meaningful and detailed than anything I've ever seen before, and we can use this in our groups. And that's what I then find out people are doing. Typically afterward, they'll take it to their groups, they'll talk it through, they'll begin using it as training materials, and as well as feedback on how can we make this process better. So it really just begins to make everyone think in process terms, and everyone becomes an improver at that point. It's like, hey, if you've got a better idea, bring it up and let's talk about it, and we'll change the diagrams accordingly.
So I think a question I get asked a lot is, are you documenting how it currently works? Or are you identifying how you could improve it as you start documenting?
Yes, very good question. And that always comes up. And people will say, are you doing the as is state or the to be state or future state or as it is now? And typically what will happen is we'll say we're going to do the as is state. But as we go through that, a lot of times people realize, well, the as is state isn't even really very clear, or it's inconsistent depending on who's doing it, that maybe they do it one way in one place and another way in another place. So what they typically wind up really working on is what I call a near future state. And what I mean by a near future state is we're trying to show what you're actually doing that's working. But if something isn't really working very well, and it won't take a huge act of Congress to change it, or a new system or something like that. If we can change the way things work by just getting kind of people on board with a new approach, then we'll go ahead and start to model it that way. to map the process with the gaps filled in, if you will. And then once they kind of complete that out and say, okay, yeah, that is the better way to do it. Let's get everyone on board with doing it that way. And so then it becomes the as is state. Now, there are opportunities, just to flip the switch a little bit, from, okay, now you've characterized what you're doing, to, we know that isn't very good and we want to move to a much better process. So then it can be an input into a typical process improvement effort, DMAIC or whichever methodology you like to use. And so, if you're using DMAIC, the first thing is define, of course, in the DMAIC acronym. And you already have the current state defined. So you're already, on the path to your improvement project. And now you can talk very specifically about, okay, here's where things are going wrong, where they're falling through the cracks. And maybe we even annotate where we want to measure some things for our improvement efforts. But then we can also begin to speculate, okay, well, if we had this system here and we changed our process this way, yeah, that would make it better. And if we give a person a new role over here, good, let's do that. So that's a real process improvement project. The as is state can be a good input into that. And then once you finally have a better process, you then can make that the new as is state once it's there.
I think people are staggered by, number one, how quickly you can create processes which make a difference. And secondly, the sorts of benefits that you can drive out in terms of that process improvement. Just because you're getting everyone on the same page and that together they're identifying the improvements that are possible. So do you have any sense of sort of the numbers or how much improvement that you're starting to see when you're doing this mapping?
Yeah, it's to some degree. What I often find is, measurement is not a strength in most organizations, but they know where the pain is. And so typically it's not as well measured as I'd like it to be, being, kind of this long time process guy. It'd be great if everything were well measured. But I have gotten some feedback, certainly on things that we've improved. One of my clients, they had, upward of 10%. Of unbilled engineering time, meaning that their engineers were, the client was coming back and saying, well, this isn't quite right. And, they didn't feel right billing them for it. So they would spend this time correcting things, or there was a misunderstanding of expectations, maybe because the contract wasn't detailed enough. And so, again, coming back to the engineers, got to redo some things or do some things they didn't know they were supposed to do in the first place. And so by doing some of the diagramming around this process, they were able to cut that more than in half, the unbilled engineering time. And that goes right to the bottom line for them. So, that was a significant improvement that they saw. Now, I don't want to exaggerate it and say that they had no idea where the problem was or what they needed to do, but by diagramming it out, it gave them a lot of confidence as they made the change that, oh yeah, this is going to work. And they in fact identified a new role in the process to coordinate some of these activities. And it's worked out much better for them ever since. I've seen lots and lots of other situations where, in fact, I'm working with a client now. They said, yeah, we continue to have problems with this. And so we kind of diagrammed out the as is state and made a lot of notes as we were going. Oh, this is where something's going wrong. And we put those notes right on the diagrams. And now they're working on the future state and saying, yeah, if we do it this way, it'll come out much better. We should avoid this problem in the future. So they know it's in the right direction. They just aren't quite as disciplined about measuring how much benefit is that really to the organization, but they know it's important. And in fact, it's on one of the managers' performance plans that they need to improve this area.
So what I'm hearing is it's quite difficult to work out what the improvement is if you've never understood, measured how bad it was in the first place. However, empirically, people know there are problems and they can see that it's improved.
Right.
And that's important and it shows that they're driving a level of process improvement in the organization. And I think it goes back to the very beginning of this discussion, which was the sorts of challenges that people have in terms of poor process.
Yes, absolutely. And, even they may have measured some of these things internally, but a lot of times companies don't want to expose that information even to consultants. So that's understandable too. But when they say, "Yeah, this has really helped us sort this out," you know that it's hit the mark for them, and they've made an improvement.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing is that obviously we live in the Salesforce world, and people are looking at how they can use Salesforce better, which is automating processes.
Mhm.
And something I've always said is that the only place automate comes before simplify is in the dictionary. You need to do this analysis up front before you start building. Otherwise, it's not just the time wasted in building it, but the time wasted in training people on something that doesn't work where you could have simplified first. So I
Yes.
think that's why I'm so excited about Salesforce has invested so heavily in the business analysis training, because it's getting
Mhm.
people to go, before you start making changes in Salesforce, which can be done very quickly, let's make sure we're making the right changes.
And you know, again, that good process documentation comes out there because people will think, oh, if we just make this change, it's going to take care of things. But unless you really are getting down to the details of who's doing what are they producing, and where's that going, you're so often things just kind of don't quite connect the way that you think they're going to until you get into that level of detail.
So thank you for watching this version of Experts React. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes. Yeah, I told them. Yeah, I told them to subscribe. Yeah, no, I've got no control over whether they do it. I asked them though, and yeah, down there. Yeah, there. I told them.